Amazon's upcoming Lord of the Rings TV show has caused quite a stir. The internet, being the cesspool of vitriol, grievance, clickbait, and tribalism that it is, became intensely divided over the diversity apparent in a Vanity Fair article that gave us some promo images of the various characters. Among them, a black elf and a female black dwarf. The clash is part of an ongoing battle over culture and identity, in which Hollywood, pushing for diversity on screen, meets pushback from irate fans about the co-opting or overwriting of lore in various properties, and the imposition of modern-day identity politics into fantasy worlds where it doesn't necessarily make much sense. Lord of the Rings fans overwhelmingly downvoted the YouTube teaser trailer. Just as abruptly, liberal journalists issued a slew of articles condemning the reactionary attitudes and unconscious racial bias of the disgruntled fans. Why does it matter, you might ask, and aren't these online critics mostly just a bunch of man-babies and trolls, perpetually moored in adolescence, clutching morbidly to the fantasy entertainment of their youth, who perhaps feel threatened by the emergence of diverse casting and misogynistically resent the promotion of strong female characters? The answer is, sure, some of them. But many approach the issue with a more grounded and reasonable cynicism. And the reality is, there are plenty of people at fault on both sides of this cultural debate. Firstly, having an abiding passion for your formative literature, films, and TV is actually a good thing. People care about the visions and fantasy worlds of great writers and filmmakers, and are entitled to feel invested in them, emotionally, and to be wary of young and identity politics-driven screenwriters who don't appreciate the canon, lore, and multi-generational fondness for particular creative properties. Such fans are generally in favor of diversity and appreciate that the Hollywood machine screwed over minorities for decades. The issue is they don't like diversity being infused into everything, especially when it doesn't seem appropriate in the context of specific fictional worlds. Casting should basically match up to the setting, even if that means having to work within limitations, and the more attempts that are made to scrunch diversity in regardless, the greater it places the show's writers in an antagonistic relation to much of the ticket-buying fanbase. The Lord of the Rings is a fantasy epic explicitly described by its author as an attempt to create an English mythology. Because of that, the books feature characters and clans derived from Anglo-Saxon myths and legends, with clearly Nordic elves and a shire evoking the villages of pre-industrial England. And while that may sit uncomfortably in the modern world of aspirational diversity, that's simply the way Tolkien conceived it. So the debate becomes, can you overwrite aspects of established lore and someone else's vision because you think it's morally progressive to do so? Studios are undoubtedly under pressure to produce content in line with contemporary culture. But like it or not, Lord of the Rings isn't about contemporary culture. It's set in an age of pre-English and European folk heritage, and critics are entitled to argue that it's not up to modern film studios to impose their modern sensibilities on established beloved classics, and are also entitled to contend that allegations of racism amount to a smokescreen to avoid engaging with the actual substance of the argument. This, of course, doesn't mean that diverse actors can't play any established white roles. Denzel Washington recently played Macbeth, who, as a Scottish nobleman, is perhaps one of the whitest characters imaginable. But Shakespeare is transcendent, and being Shakespeare, any actor is first and foremost a vessel for expression of the lyrical beauty of the bard's writing, and it is therefore more reasonable to abstract the role from an actor's background. These battles over representation aren't limited to fictional characters. In the recent Anne Boleyn miniseries, the show's star, black actress Jodie Turner-Smith, raised eyebrows as a woman of color portraying the white Tudor queen. While some of the criticism was undoubtedly vitriolic, she's a woman and the internet exists, many reasonable people were simply making the point that Anne Boleyn was a white person who literally existed historically, and casting a black woman came across as a jarring imposition of diversity onto a historical narrative where it just didn't make a great deal of sense. The show's creators had adopted something called an identity-conscious approach to choosing its stars. A fellow actor said that it was all about this being the right person for the job rather than what we, as a society, might perceive as the right look for the job. Anne Boleyn was beautiful, witty, vibrant, intelligent, and Jodie is all of those things. Undoubtedly, Jodie Turner-Smith is all of those things, but so is Lucy Liu, and it's not unreasonable to suggest that Lucy Liu might look slightly incongruous as Cleopatra or Joan of Arc, or that Temuera Morrison might not be the first choice to play George Washington or Alexander the Great, irrespective of the identity-conscious approach taken by a film studio. Part of the film industry's drive seems to stem from the idea that, after several centuries of Eurocentric history and canonical literature having piled up, there's just too much of a wealth of material for it to be reasonable to shut out young actors of colour anymore, and something had to give for the sake of inclusivity. That's an understandable motivation and spirit, but that doesn't mean it's always a workable proposition in reality, especially in the eyes of loyal fans who don't want to see their favourite fictional worlds used opportunistically to promote progressive values. These kind of cultural debates have been raging for years now, and the YouTubers and podcasters who push back against these cultural narratives have some legitimate grievances about the tactics of modern Hollywood in bastardizing the work of others to service a present-day social agenda. There are solid motivations and also negative elements on both sides of this culture war over entertainment. Ultimately, this involves holding two thoughts in our heads at the same time: that someone can be strongly supportive of liberal and progressive ideals, but also resent the strident excesses of identity politics. That someone can be broadly supportive of inclusivity and diversity, and also think that it doesn't have to be imposed everywhere. And, bear with me here, it's possible you might not be a reactionary or subconsciously biased or threatened if you think that shoehorning in inclusivity in the form of ethnically diverse dwarves and elves comes across as just a little contrived and cringy.